Hello, everybody. This is Christy Houle, the host of the Classroom Matters podcast, and I am joined today by J. Michael Hall. Mike is the founder of the fatherhood engagement program, Strong Fathers, Strong Families. And since 2003, this program has been implemented at schools throughout the United States and internationally, reaching over 225,000 dads and 500,000 kids. Michael is the father of two sons and the husband to a very successful middle school reading teacher. He's also a former special education teacher and a recovering middle school principal. He is passionate about focusing on what fathers do well and giving them the opportunity to do some of those things with their children. Michael, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
I want to start with just sort of diving into your extensive background in education. You know, obviously you've done a lot of work to build up to Strong Fathers, Strong Families. So before we really get into what you're doing with that organization and what that means, talk a little bit about what your background is in education.
I'll try to give you the montage on that. So I was actually the son of a coach. So I grew up in the school culture. I was around the high school. I was around the locker room, heard about politics at home, dealt with politics when we moved, you know, all those good things. My dad was a biology teacher and a football coach at the high school level. I went to college. I was going to teach agriculture. We lived on the farm. I was big in FFA. I got my degree in agriculture from Abilene Christian University, but I didn't have my VOTEC certification. So I got out, started, I got married the middle of my senior year. So we were in love and we were broke. So I went and I did sales for a little bit. And then an opportunity came up for an alternative certification program, one of the first ones in Texas at the time, for special education teachers. And the idea was I'll teach special ed for a year, get my certification, and then see if I can't move on. Well, I ended up being a special ed teacher for 5 years while in Abilene ISD. The first 2 years that I taught, superintendent kind of figured out I was a school guy, took me under his wing, started talking about, you know, being an admin, and actually was looking at that at the end of my second year. And so I taught 5 years. I became a principal on the next, after 5 years at an intermediate school. I was there for a year, a lot of school politics going on there. And then I ended up at a middle school with about 930 kids in Joshua, Texas, and did 3 years there. I had a young family. And I was trying to get families engaged at the middle school level, which is always a question, always a challenge, always, you know, this great quest, and trained with some really great people. I just took about everything I could. And there were some guys out of Austin called the Center for Successful Fathering. And they came in and lit me up about father engagement, but they also lit me up about my own, you know, fathering. And so we did a father program at my school in January of '99. I was telling these guys, here's what happens if you're not involved with your kids. Right? Here's what happens if you are involved. Here's what happens if you're not, realizing I was spending more time raising their kids than I was my own. And so my wife and I, a couple of weeks later, we said, we got to make a change. I want to be around my kids more. And so she decided she would go back to the classroom. I resigned then and, you know, finished out the year strong. And then we both were teachers the next year. And I continued to do fatherhood stuff, working with the group out of Austin, kind of as a side gig, kind of jumping in and helping anytime I could, facilitating programs. And then they hired me at the end of that next teaching year. And so I worked for them for 3 years, and like a lot of nonprofits, kind of got too big for its britches, if you will, and kind of imploded. I was going back to the classroom, and everybody that I worked with said, you're fired up about this, you ought to keep doing it. And I did. We started Strong Fathers in 2003. No paycheck, no contracts, no nothing, and just went at it. You know, and I had a lot of experience and a lot of contacts from the work that I had done. And so we've been doing that we're in the middle of our 19th school year. We worked in, I think, over 45 states. Again, I have every copy of every sign-in sheet we've ever done. So we know it's over 225,000 dads across the country in schools and Head Starts. We've trained all over the country. We have several curricula that we use for Head Start, for schools, for high schools, for at-risk kids. We have a 10-week program for guys that are court ordered that is more of a social servants deal that we don't do a lot, but I mean, it's still available. And so we're always looking at ways we can do. When the pandemic hit, we went virtual. So we were able to kind of develop some pretty successful father engagement programs for dads and kids, including we ended up doing, because it was virtual, we ended up working in Singapore for about 10 weeks with about 200 to 300 dads every Friday night for 10 weeks, which was insane. I didn't think I'd ever work in Singapore, and I didn't think I'd ever work on Friday night at 9 o'clock with dads, but they didn't have anywhere to go because of the pandemic. And then last year we did a ton of virtual programs, and this year we're doing some virtual and a lot more back to in-person, in schools. We're doing our Bring Your Dad to School Day, Dad and Kid Math, Dad and Kid Science Nights, Dad and Kid Reading. So we're back on the road somewhat, and we're also doing virtual. So, and like I said, we've been able to, I speak at national Head Start conferences, national PTA, national school board conferences, which is how we drive our business also. But that's an opportunity to get out there and meet a lot of folks and, and get kind of spread the word on how important it is to engage fathers in education. I did a webinar for the Region 9 Head Start folks out on the West Coast. It's all the Western states with Head Start, and had to figure out some technology to kind of show my hands-on activities. We were doing it. People said, "This is great. Do you have this on video?" And I said, "Yes, we do." And I didn't. But we developed Strong Fathers Friday right there on the spot. And we ended up doing 16 videos, 16 weeks of video each week in English and in Spanish for early childhood activities that people contracted with us. And that kind of kept us alive. People still need to have virtual training. So we didn't have to charge for travel. So we were able to train more people that way. And then the Singapore guys, so these are, type A hardworking Singapore dads, just going to work, maybe eating breakfast with their kid, but working all day, coming home at 8, patting their kid on the head, going to dinner, and kids are going to school. When the pandemic hit, these dads have to go back home and their kids are at home, and that's a totally new dynamic. And so it really was kind of the perfect storm for us to reach that many, because I couldn't imagine 200 to 300 dads on Zoom. These guys already had the technology and the availability, and they definitely had the need. They're like, "I don't know what's going on, but we got to do something." I was actually able to coach a group of those guys after those sessions, because some of those, it was still in the pandemic and they still needed help. And it was a great deal. And I think we might still be doing something with them in 22, as we get ready to kind of fire back up.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing. And so I want to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing with Strong Fathers, Strong Families. And when I've listened to many of your lectures, I've listened to a lot of your presentations, and in a lot of those, you talk about the difference between fatherlessness and fatherfullness. And I think that is a really important thing for folks to understand. And I believe in a lot of your presentations and your conversations and your lectures, you talk about, yes, there is an issue of fatherlessness, and we all know it's bad. However, we need to talk more about the fatherfullness and what things can be done to fix that. So dive into those two terms and like the difference and how your organization is going about helping with some challenges for both.
Yeah. So when you look at 225,000 dads, not only did we keep count, but we did that because we were getting early on in this work, we kind of figured out how to fill the room up. And that's really nice. But then when we had a full room, we had to decide, okay, what are we doing with them? Who are these guys? And all kind of stuff. And so the TED Talk that I did called Fatherlessness was really in response, because most of this field, if you will, around fatherhood, typically more so at the government level, social service level, is all about deficit, right? Like, these kids don't have dads. Well, and one of the things I say is 100% of the kids in our country have a father, because my dad taught biology. I know that's true. Now, the painful part is, yeah, we know a lot of kids don't have dads around. It is not as much as people think. And I still feel like we have a ton of work to do. That's not the issue. Our job is to engage dads. So when I was a middle school principal, the kids that came through my office with behavior academic problem either had no dad at home, which we understood, or kind of more shocking to me, there were dads at home that weren't connected. So what we have focused on in the field is all these kids that don't have a dad under the roof, right? 70% of the kids right now in the country live in 2-parent homes. Their biological father may not be one of the 2 parents, but 70%, and that's it's definitely a number different than 1964, but it's not what people think. On top of that other 30% of kids that don't live under the same roof with their father, well, actually out of that 30%, about 10 to 12% of those single parent homes, at one time it was 17. I don't know that out of this study that would be that. but those kids are living with a single father, right? And we would hope that they would have access to their mother as well. But even those kids that don't live under the same roof with their father have regular access to their dads. One of the studies in Head Start, in inner city Head Starts, they found that 65% of the kids in that Head Start had regular daily or weekly access to their fathers. But the dads aren't on paper, or the dad doesn't live there. And so we take all the assumptions and kind of push it over there. What we find is when dads are invited, they show up, right? Like these guys will come. I've had dads come to school things from, a dad came from Russia to El Paso for a bring your dad to school day. Was a military contractor working in Russia, jumped a C-130 to an air base in Germany, went from the air base to New Jersey, jumped a Delta flight to Jersey, from Jersey to El Paso to be there on a Friday, bring your dad to school day, and was returning back to Russia to go to work on Monday. We had another young man that came to Winona, Texas, which is a fantastic little town here east of Dallas. And he came from Djibouti, Africa. He was at Camp Lemonnier and took 2 days to get home, had a 3-day pass at home. The middle day was bring your dad to school day for his pre-K kid. So he went to class, and he did this so he could be at this event, and then took 2 days to get back. And I have dads, I had a dad that picked up a load in New Orleans in his tractor trailer rig at midnight and shows up in Duncanville, Texas the next morning at 8 o'clock. By the way, it's not an 8-hour drive from New Orleans to Duncanville. So he was hitting it. But the reason I found out about it was during that day, in that morning, as we're going to class with the dads, there's an announcement. Whoever has a tractor trailer rig parked in the bus lane, if you could move your tractor trailer rig, we have buses still coming in. He said, yeah, I knew about this event. I changed my load schedule or whatever they do. And he said, I made sure I could get a load picked up and get here in time for this. So pre-COVID, 18-19 school year, we averaged out of about 80 programs, 140 families per program. And that's kind of standard for us. I mean, we had an average at one time of about 100, 108. And then that year, partially because of the schools we were working with, not that all of them were bigger, but we just had really good, support along with us from the principals and everything. They did the job we asked them to do. And we had a handful of larger schools as well, but our average was 140 over 80 programs. So we now say, if parents aren't coming to your programs, it's not your parents, it's your program. We tend to blame our families for what we're not doing to make it more palatable, more enjoyable, more, more exciting to show up at your kid's school, because it's not going to be a waste of their time, and there's value to it for their time. So that same thing about fatherlessness, a lot of the folks that are in the same field that I am, they don't profit from the solutions, they profit from the problem. So they don't have curriculum, they don't have things, and they're working with guys that, and I hate to say lowest common denominator, but these are guys that have tons of challenges, and there's a need for that work. I do some of that, but there's a need for that work, but that's not all the work that we need to do in fatherhood. You've got guys that are just seem to be at the top of their game in their fathering and parenting, their career. That may be 10 to 15%. We've got these guys that are struggling with addiction, struggling with multiple families, incarceration, all kind of issues. That's that other 15% that really needs that serious intervention. But then we're not talking about the middle 70%, which are heading one direction or the other. What do we do with that 70%? Because there's tons of dads that are just looking for a way to help their kid. They want to be engaged. They're not always sure about it. And so that's what we do, is we try to do everything we can to connect dads to kids and then help them stay connected. We use the schools to connect to dads. I'm in the kid business. We do this for the sake of children, but we work with adult men because of what they can do for children. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in talking about these fathers that have come these long miles and they were invited to this, day with your dad, do you feel that because of tradition, because it's always been, as far back as, the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, those traditional roles of the man goes to work and the mom raises the children, that we have in some unintentional way, and moms do this, I've been guilty of this with my 3 children and grandparents, we've sort of pushed dads out of being involved with the children. And so now we have sort of stuck with old traditions, although that society and norms are moving forward with roles, and we're still sort of stuck in those traditional roles. And that's something that's really challenging for fathers to be able to get involved.
Yeah, so part of it is that tradition. And if you go back to 1900, the majority of our teachers were male, right? Like you watch the old Westerns and it was always a school marm. The reason that women were teaching in the West is because men could make more money doing something else. But in, when the suburbs first came around, all of that began to change around the 50s and 60s. Education became a female dominated environment. And so with the other thing that happened in our culture was the idea that a kid, as long as they have a loving parent, they're going to be fine. And so dads the idea was that dads walked, but dads also got kicked out in that cultural piece, in the divorce courts. And as people begin to split up and everybody no fault divorce, all of that happened. One of the things we fight now is a bias against men, which is just a real undercurrent. And then also, as we begin to bring men back in the school, they're like, well, how are we going to do a background check on every dad? And I'm like, you don't do a background check on moms. You don't do a background check at the carnival. You don't do a background check during the PTA meeting. But because, we want to be safe, but because I'm bringing men in, what has happened is at the most negative piece, it's not everywhere, that we're treating men as perpetrators before we treat them as parents, right? They come under suspicion when they show up at school. So it's not a very welcoming environment. That's a big part of our job, is not only to get schools to understand they're not dangerous. So we've had all these shootings like I was a principal during Columbine, not at Columbine, but that day shook all of us, right? And so we began to put all these safety measures in place. We're putting locks on the doors. We're double, triple checking the parents, all these things. We've had 2 incidences in the United States since Columbine where there's been somebody from the outside come into the school to cause harm. 2 out of all these other things. We've not had a bunch of men coming into school to harm children. Matter of fact, we bring our kids to school. We kind of want you to keep them for 7 hours. We don't want another one, right? But the idea is like, these men are going to steal children. I'm like, where is this happening? Where are just men lining up to steal children? Are there crazy people out there? Yes. And they're going to find a way to do that? Yes. That's not what's going on in our school. This guy has 3 kids in our school. Quit giving him the once over. I have one school where we sign in, to come into school, and the principal is double checking the name on their license to make sure they weren't signing in with another name. And I'm like, that's insane. Number one, even if he put a wrong name, what harm would he do? But how would you find out? Right? It's just that whole thing. And then when we do get a room full of guys, when we do get 100, 200 dads in the school, the kids all behave better. They find out we don't eat children. They're all excited about that. And they're like, wow, nobody, and the dads are way more scared of being there than anybody should be of a dad. I ask my dads every time when we do a bring your dad to school day, they spend about 45 minutes in class. And then we say, the dads, then class goes on. Kids keep doing their cool things. Dads come back to me in the cafeteria and I ask them, how many of you have been inspired to become a teacher based on what you've seen here today? And I don't get a hand raised. Right. Like I've had 3 guys I had a year where we had 22,000 dads in schools at those events. I had 3 guys raise their hand the whole year. Right. And I don't know how broke they were. I don't know what their situation, and some guys I love teaching, but yeah, the rest of the guys are like, no, I'll be back at 3:30 to pick them up. Thanks. Yeah. But it is that idea that it is mom's job. And when we tell dads, here's what happens specifically when dads get involved, that doesn't happen when moms get involved. It's not that you're the second string parent. It's that you're the other parent with another set of skills that are much different and just as valuable in different ways. And I think that has helped us really get guys engaged on that and our job is easy because nobody's telling these guys, look, what you're doing is important. And here's the research about, it's not just me saying, I think it'd be cool if dads got involved. The research backs it up from 0 to 18 beyond, all through those phases, dads have different indicators of what happens to kids when they get engaged.
Yeah. And I think that it's interesting because obviously everything that you're saying is spot on. Being a former elementary school principal myself, yes, that is exactly how we would treat fathers when they would come in. It didn't happen very often. Of course, moms were always the one to come in. So why is it taking this? Because everything that you're saying is making sense. Why is it taking something like strong fathers, strong families for us to break out of this cycle, and to really have more opportunities to get dads involved? Because like you said, you come with a different set of skills. I kind of chuckle at when you talk about how different, dads are when they read stories to kids. And sometimes even as a mom myself, and my husband's involved, I'll be like, oh, maybe he's not doing it the way I would do it, or maybe he's not. And he's like, just go away. I've got it. We're good.
I'm watching.
So I'm sure that moms are sort of probably part of the problem. And, I think a lot too, Mike, as you're talking, I'm sitting here thinking about my own children and their father and my husband and things like that. I've even been guilty of saying, oh, don't bother your dad. He worked really hard today. He probably just wants to rest. When my children have said, oh, I want to go take this to dad, or I want to see if dad can do this, I'm like, oh, no, honey, instead of just allowing that interaction to happen. So do you see that a lot? Just those obstacles really just sort of still getting in there, and dad's not knowing what to do. They're like, well, I guess, the smart husbands anyway, well, I'm just going to let my wife handle it.
Yeah.
and not get in the way.
Yeah. It's that whole mix, because one of the first thoughts when we, I would say started this field, I've been doing this since 98. And so the interesting part, I did this seminar the other day where they were showing videos of all these experts. And I'm like, I've been in the car or on the dais or on a panel with every one of these guys, and men and women. But kind of the part of that history is when you look at the negative situations, like dads that have walked out, right? And dads that don't know how to get involved, and dads that didn't, but the idea was, oh, he didn't have a father, so he doesn't know how to father, so we got to help him with that. Well, we go so deep on that, we're like, we're trying to get them to the psychiatrist, as opposed to just like, hey, when you do this, it's really good. When you do this, like, I don't tell dads what they're not doing, because I don't know what they're not doing. That's a deficit-based approach. Whereas we say, when strong fathers do this, based on research, practical experience, these things typically happen. Like you talked about reading. When a mom reads to kids, they learn to read, they learn to love to read, they learn to love books. It's fantastic that moms read to their kids, and we need moms to read to their kids. When dads read to kids, they learn to read, they learn to read, they learn to love books. All that's fantastic. But when dads read to kids, their kids' verbal skills increase by up to 15%. That doesn't happen when moms read to them. And I have to kind of, I train a lot of females, and they're like, I can read. I'm like, I know you can read, but what you do is, it's not better, it's different. And I think that's one of our bigger challenges, is for some reason, we're valuing a parent over another. And part of it is because they're different. That's a big part of our training. A big part of what we have laid out to people is, number one, we are absolutely different, even though we are not unequal, but we're different, right? Moms are not unequal to dads, dads are not unequal to moms, but we are definitely different in all these different ways. And that's okay. And one is not more valuable than the other. If mom is not there, we lose an amazing amount of things that kids need. What we find in research is, come to find out, when dad's not there, we miss it's a totally different set of things. So mom is that center of the universe. Kids can run home to mom. Moms can advocate for kids, kiss those boo-boos, take care of all that stuff. Typically, dad is the one that gets them to move more into risk, because mom protects a little too much sometimes. And dad also sets parameters, like, dad, swing me higher. And we swing higher, and he goes higher. And dad says, no, we can swing this high, but we're not swinging higher than that. Yes, you can drive to school, but you're not driving to the mall yet. Yes, you can have friends, but he better not be a boy. Those kind of parameters that we set. And those things work in conjunction with two parents working together under the same roof or not. And that's what's good for kids. But I think that bottom line is, because they're different, we think we have to value one over the other. So the research says that both parents are equally incompetent at birth, right? But with mom's natural inclination to protect, which can be a challenge for her in postpartum, but also with her getting the support through through classes, through the system, all of that is just different than what dad gets. And I'm not as huge on changing. I think we need to do a lot more around pre-birth, prenatal, postnatal, which would make a huge difference, because if we can get that dad to understand how important his role is, we have him for life.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I love. When we catch a dad at first grade that never knew what to do, never knew he was important, if we get him to know that in first grade, he'll be there when that kid graduates.
Yeah.
Regardless of the relationship with mom, he's going to be an engaged father with his kid because he's now found out what his role was. And so that's a big part of our job, is to give everyone in the, you know, all the stakeholders, if you will, an understanding that dad's job is not just nice, it's imperative, it's important that dad gets involved for the sake of kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, as you're talking about setting parameters and, you know, sort of being the one to sort of not be as protective as mom and sort of push them a little bit more, do you see a large difference in whether the father has a son or a daughter? And what are some of the differences and some of the different, I wouldn't say, don't necessarily want to say intimidation, but, you know, sometimes if you, you know, you're talking with fathers that have sons versus daughters, there might be a little bit more fear when, you know, trying to have that father role with one over the other. So do you see a difference in that at all when you're talking with fathers about sons and daughters?
Fathers definitely father sons and daughters differently. But what we find is if we can get them connected at an early age, that's what I love about working with early Head Start and Head Start. Then what comes down the pike is you know, and I saw this a lot as a middle school principal. The dad goes, I don't know what to do. She just cries all the time. I don't know. I didn't even know what I said. And she started crying. And I'm like, talk to mom. And the mom's like, yeah, that's what we do. You know, that's what we do. And particularly when we're 14 and we've got all this stuff going on. But what we find is when dads are engaged early. So one of the things I really like to talk about is the research around when dad has a warm physical relationship with his daughter. So he hugs her, he high fives her, he wrestles with her like he wrestles with the boys, right? And there is a time in development where, like, there's a place where you can do that even with, you know, a growing girl, if you will, but also there's a place where you may need to give her a protective space. Right. But everybody gets so kind of, it's like, no, a dad that's working will know, and it has a relationship with his daughter will know. But when a dad has that form with physical relationship with his daughter, she does better in math and science, but she also does better in so many different things. So I was at a parents' teachers conference, actually in St. Louis, Missouri, and asked 220 women in the room that it's a joke, but it's not a joke. I said, sometimes kids will learn that moms will lie to you. You know, and they're like, I can't believe you called moms liars. And I said, my mama told me I was cute when I was 7. We have the pictures. That woman was lying, right? My daddy never told me I was cute. My dad told me I was fat and I was strong, and we have the pictures, and he was right. But I asked these ladies, you know, to try to kind of justify what I just said. I said, if your mom told you you were beautiful, would you believe it? And out of a room of 220 women, I kid you not, about 200 women in unison said no. And I'm like, it even shocked me because I've, you know, talked about this, and I'm like, holy moly, what just happened? And I said, okay, why would you not believe that your mom thinks you're beautiful? And they said, well, that's my mom. It's like what she's supposed to do. Or my mom would never do anything that would hurt my feelings. And I said, well, would your dad? And I said, well, maybe. But when dad is also the male, right? It's not just that he's a parent. It is the male parent says you're beautiful. Dad doesn't play. If you're doing something dumb, dad's going to tell you. And when dad tells you, it has a different weight. It is not better than what moms need to tell their daughters they're beautiful too. It has a different weight. And that's what we try to explain is we just kind of get away from putting value to one to the other and understand the value of both. And the research and education is huge for what dads do for daughters, as well as what dads do for sons. We think it's all about masculine role model, but there's a million other things with dads reading, with dads using math from their work in their home around both boys and girls, but more so letting both their kids, sons and daughters, know you can do anything you want. You have this ability. You're smart. You know, my dad never told me I was beautiful, but I think I'm okay with that. And I love my sister, and I think he should have told her more. You know, I think there's no way he could have told her too much.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, I'm resonating so much with everything that you're saying. And it's funny because like maybe 2 days ago, my 13-year-old son, he was wearing a shirt or something. And I said, oh my gosh, son, you look so great in that shirt. And I was just going on, and he said, yeah, whatever, you're my mom, you have to say that kind of stuff. And so I kid you not, I was like, well, I don't have to, but you're probably right. I probably would say it no matter if you looked awful, I would. So it's really so true that is the difference in the role, because my husband would have never, and he did look really handsome in the shirt. I mean, but that my son knew that. He's like, he said, yeah, you're my mom, you have to say that kind of stuff about me. And so I think it's so true. It's good to hear it from someone because you know it, but if you don't hear it, and I think that, I'm really hoping with this episode, and I'm going to be pushing this at every father that I can, that, I'm sure a large majority of our audiences are female and women, but I'm going to make sure and say, dads, so that they're, the women are passing this over to the men. I think, one of the most important things that your organization does, and something extremely important that you're talking about, is that allowing husbands and fathers to know their impact on their children and the importance of the relationship and things that they're saying to their children, and that they may not know in the moment that it's meaning anything. But I can tell you from personal experience, my dad was he was the single most influential, important person in my life. And, he did all of those things. And so I don't know if he actually knew that, and then when we lost him about 6 years ago, it was almost like, okay, what do I do now? Right. Because he was that core, he was the center, he was identity for us. And so I hope that he knew his impact, but dads that are listening, you're so important, and their impact is so, so vital. And so to kind of wrap things up, I'd really love to know from you, what did the role between you and your father play in what you're doing now? And have you went back and really thought about that impact on you, and also your impact on your children as well?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because, as I talked about, when I first got into the field, everything was centered around at-risk fathers, is what they said, and fatherlessness, right? And it's an issue. It's a real problem. I'm not playing that down, but that's not and number one, not everyone is fatherless. And so the idea was, in some of these meetings and initiatives and things, they were saying at-risk fathers. And I'd say, who are we talking about? And they're like, so the idea was teen fathers, incarcerated or formerly incarcerated fathers, unemployed fathers, undereducated fathers, which are definitely at risk. And I said, what about IBM dads and EDS dads? And, now it would be Amazon and Google dads, what about, because the idea was it was only dads that were, in split families, only dads in low income environments. And there's plenty of challenges there. I work in those environments every day, but I'm like, what about all these other dads? Same thing what I saw in school. So as I began to do this work, I was really challenged of, why am I here? Because I know my dad. So I live on Tim Hall Road, which is named after my great grandfather. I live on a farm that he owned, but never lived there. My granddad bought it from him. My dad moved there when he was 3. My dad bought it from my granddad. We moved there when I was in high school. I moved back there in 2001. So I have that legacy, but among my peers and colleagues, they're coming from, I didn't have a dad, my dad wasn't around. So that's why it's important to them, right? And I was like, what's my place? Why am I here? What's the deal? And I realized part of it was, nobody's talking about how it should be. And I had a great dad. I lost him about 9 years ago. I had a great dad and had a great relationship with him. So he wasn't the perfect role model of a dad, except he was a great dad. But I knew what it looked like to have dads around and what that legacy meant. So when my granddad passed away, my dad was 46, I was 21. My dad was a tenderhearted guy. About 3 days after my granddad passed away, my dad sits on the end of the bed and said, I don't know who I'm going to go to for advice. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, when I was 18, you were an idiot. I spent 3 years away from home out in the real world, and I'm starting to think you know stuff. And now you're telling me it was not you, it was my granddad, right? But what he meant was, there's now no longer anybody between me and the rest of the real world. Mm-hmm. Like at the age of 46, even though my dad had several mortgages, several careers, had 3 kids going to high school, college, and not in jail, fairly successful individual, he always had his father that had more experience beyond that than he did. So he always had that dad that he could depend on. And now that dad was gone. I've talked about that extensively around the country. And when my dad passed away, I mean, I was able to be at peace because he had a heart transplant. We knew he was really struggling, so we knew of his last days. But yeah, I experienced that in my own life right off the bat. So we now run the family farm, and I just lament what I didn't pay attention to. And a lot of it was what my dad didn't tell me, and so that does play into what I try to do with my sons. And now my sons are 25 and 30. They're fantastic young men. They're educated. They're in relationships. One of them bought his own house. They're all paying their own bills. They're doing everything I would ask them to do. But they still drive me crazy. I tell them, you guys are really smart for 25 and 30, but you're really dumb for 55, right? As a 55-year-old, y'all don't know nothing. They're not supposed to. So part of what I'm learning too is what kind of grace did my dad show me at 25 and 30? And so I have that example of this might drive you crazy and you might need to address it, but also what did your dad do? And my dad addressed things that were important, and he let those other things go because he knew life. He had taught me, and he knew whatever teaching he didn't give me, life was about to teach me also. So you're going to pay attention to that teaching one way or the other. I have a good relationship with both my kids. One thing I've really worked hard at is to never kind of make them our poster children, right? Like I don't bring them around much because I don't want them to tell everybody how much I wasn't a strong father, because they have plenty of stories. But I also never wanted to put them in that place of like I will step out and talk to dads about where I've been as a father, but my job is to facilitate experiences for them to learn, not to be a model father. And I think that's a challenge in some of this work, is somebody wants to define that. A guy could be in and out of prison. A guy could have all kind of addiction challenges. A guy can have some real issues in his life. But I've seen these guys, even though they have a history and have some challenges, are some of the best dads on the planet. They look out for their kids. They make sure everything is taken care of. They get them educated. They fight for them. They teach them to be respectful. They've had some issues in their past. They have some challenges ahead of them, but they are, they're not word cleaver, but they're amazing dads in some really kind of extraordinary circumstances, but they're really good dads. And so that's one of the stories we like to tell about all these guys that I know that you would not expect to be a good dad because of our definition, but based on what they're doing for their kid are absolutely some of the best dads on the planet.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so important too. And what a great sort of way to end the show is that I think as educators too, because I've been an educator for 20 plus years, we need to stop being judgmental and looking at, the outside appearance, because like you just said, there are many dads that do suffer and have, maybe not made the best choices, but they are phenomenal dads. And, kids are funny because no matter how much of a failure you feel that you are, or your parents feel that they are, your kids still think that you are the best thing since sliced bread. So I admire the work that you're doing. I think it's extremely important. And I'm so grateful that you took some time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. And so please tell all of our listeners where they can find you, where they can get more resources, where they can sort of hook up and contact you.
Yeah, so the best way is to go to strongfathers.com. That's kind of more of our business page. Strongfathers.org was focused on our dads that we were working with in schools. Since COVID, we're looking at kind of rewriting that to give it a different kind of a resource. The strongfathers.com, there's a contact link on our page. We'd love for you to hit us up, tell us how we can help. It looks like we may be doing an online course specifically for dads in 2022. And matter of fact, we can do this. If you'll go to strongfathers.com/2022, we'll have a registration form there and you can sign up and we'll send you some information just about free resources. And then also some of the things we'll be offering directly to dads. On strongfathers.com, you can find everything we do for schools and early childhood environments. But if you're a dad out there, if you know a dad, we have a lot of educators that we work with that want me to talk to their sons, but more want me to talk to their son-in-laws. You need to talk to my son-in-law. So we may call it the son-in-law class, right? So strongfathers.com/2022, and we'll have a quick registration page there to send you more information.
Well, Mike, thank you again so much. And we will make sure and list all of that information on the podcast description page. So I want to keep in touch and maybe later in the year 2022, see how things are moving forward for you. All the best of luck to you and the work that you're doing. And once again, this is Christy Houle signing off for this episode of Classroom Matters. And don't forget to check out all of our great resources on the educate.today website.